This is Lecture 1, Part 1. Once again, my name is Jin Kim, and I'll be your instructor this semester. This is a basic Introduction to Social Welfare Policy lecture. But before we dive into the materials, I just want to offer a quick tip about how to get the most out of these lectures. I would suggest that you go ahead and print out the PowerPoint slides before viewing the lectures, such that you have the handouts in front of you, and then you can go ahead and jot down notes as you see fit as we're moving along. I think that's the way in which you're going to get the most out of these lectures. So if you haven't done so already, I'll give you a chance to go back and print out those PowerPoint slides now. And once you've done that, we can go ahead and jump into the material. For me, the logical place to start is with the definition of social welfare policy. And the first place I look to is Wikipedia. So not the most useful or the most helpful resource, I think, for our purposes, but nevertheless, Wikipedia says this about social welfare policy. It says, it's that part of public policy that has to do with social issues. So not too helpful, but it does tell us that social welfare policy is a branch of public policy. That's useful for us. So we know that public policy is the umbrella under which this term social welfare policy falls. So we know that public policy is a bit broader in scope than what we cover in social welfare policy. The next resource I go to is Harvard University, a more credible source. This is the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. This is a definition of social policy, not necessarily social welfare policy. For me, social policy is a bit broader than social welfare policy. And so they say it's, once again, that it's public policy in practice. And then they list a bunch of areas or topics that are typically covered in a social policy course, namely inequality, healthcare, criminal justice, and so forth. Now, for me, this definition is a bit too specific. It lists specific topic areas, but I prefer something a bit more broad, so not as broad as the public policy definition, but not as specific as this particular definition. And so that brings us to our textbook definition offered by Denito. And so she says that social welfare policy is what a government in the U.S., so we're talking about the U.S. government naturally, so what a government in the U.S. chooses to do or not to do. So it's either government action or it can be government inaction, and it typically has to do with income, services, opportunities, those types of things that affect vulnerable populations. So if we're dealing with the aged, the blind, the disabled, and so on and so forth, we're talking about social welfare policy. If it's government action or inaction that affects a vulnerable population, it has to do with income, services, and opportunities. That's social welfare policy according to our textbook author. So I give some examples here. So the first program listed there in your slides, we have Social Security. We have the acronym in parentheses, Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance. I think it's a pretty slam dunk case. I think it's a simple case that can be made that this is in fact, that this fits our definition of social welfare policy. We have government action, certainly. This is a federal program, so we have a federal government involvement. It affects a vulnerable population, or populations for that matter. We're talking about income support for seniors and persons with disabilities, so I think it fits nicely within our definition of social welfare policy. The next example that I offer is supplemental security income. This is another federal program, so government action, we have that part of the definition satisfied. It's another income support program. We have a program offering income support to persons of low income and assets. And we have vulnerable population. This is a program for aged, blind, and disabled. So certainly within our definition of social welfare policy. The next example that I offer is temporary assistance for needy families. This is a name given to our welfare system, our current welfare system. We've had different names over the years, but this is our current federal welfare policy. Certainly fits our definition. We have a vulnerable population. We have persons who are low income, persons with low income and/or assets. We have federal government involvement. This is the federal name. Typically, states administer welfare policy. So either way, we have a federal government or state government involvement, and so that fits our definition. We have a couple of health insurance programs. We have Medicare, Medicaid. These are our public health insurance programs, one offering health insurance to seniors and persons with disabilities. And then we have Medicaid offering health insurance to kids, seniors, persons with disabilities, and pregnant women. So both affect vulnerable populations. We have government action. Medicare is a federal program. Medicaid is largely administered by states. So once again, we have government action. So I think those fit our definition very nicely. Child Protective Services, another example that I offer here. So Child Protective Services are often administered at the state level. So once again, we have government action at the state level. We have a vulnerable population. We have kids who have been maltreated. So fits nicely, once again, within our definition of social welfare policy. I offer some other examples as well. We have foreign policy, military policy. These I do not cover in this class. I think it's a bit more tenuous in terms of whether or not it fits our definition, our Donedo definition of social welfare policy. These are typically topics that are covered possibly in your political science, international relations type courses. We have environmental policy. That is one topic. This is one topic that's covered in public policy courses often, but we don't cover that here. Educational policy, I think there's a stronger case that can be made that we have, in fact, a social welfare policy. So long as we have a public, we're involving public schooling, so we have government action, we certainly have a vulnerable population in the way of kids or youths, I think that fits our definition. We do cover educational policy, not in this class, but in your second semester advanced policy class, we cover educational policy. And then we have tax policy as another example. To the extent that the policy in question affects low-income populations, so for instance, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, or the Child Tax Credit for that matter, lower-income populations. We have vulnerable populations, we have government action or inaction, so certainly it's considered social welfare policy, and we do cover EITC in this course. This is a bit more academic in nature, but we're talking here about how we classify all the different policies out there. So sometimes we classify policies based on how one becomes eligible for the policy or program in question. Other times we classify based on the type of service or benefits that's offered. Sometimes we make a distinction between entitlement and non-entitlement programs. So in terms of eligibility categories or classifying based on eligibility, we often make a distinction between social insurance programs and public assistance programs. This is a distinction that was made in the Social Security Act of 1935. So we'll get into this in a bit more detail, but for the time being, just note that social insurance programs typically require some form of contribution. It's a contributory scheme typically. In terms of the eligibility requirements, but in terms of a public assistance program, typically what you have is a means test, which means you have to have low income and or assets to qualify. So some programs fall under social insurance, under that particular umbrella, and others fall under public assistance. We also make a distinction between entitlement programs and non-entitlement programs. By an entitlement program, all we mean there is that if you're found to be eligible for a particular program or policy, there is an obligation on the part of the government unit to provide you with benefits or services in the way of an entitlement program. Where you have a non-entitlement program, even if you're found to be eligible, there's no obligation necessarily on the part of the government unit provide you with benefits or services. So the litmus test typically is to check for a wait list. If you see a wait list for a particular policy or program, that's typically going to be a non-entitlement program. We can also classify, we're continuing with this academic exercise of classifying all these different policies, but we can also classify based on the type of service or benefit that's offered. Some programs offer income support or income maintenance. I've run through some of these before. OASDI, Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance, that's our Social Security program. It provides income support for aged and for the aged and persons with disabilities. Providing income support, we classify based on the fact that it provides income as the main benefit. So TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, is another example of an income support program. We have Supplemental Security Income, I said, is an income support program for the aged, blind, and the disabled. So these are all examples of income maintenance programs. We can classify based on nutrition assistance. Some programs offer nutrition assistance. SNAP, so Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is it used to be called the Food Stamp Program. You may know it as the Food Stamp Program. That's the more current name. Offering nutrition assistance, we can classify based on that fact. Women, infants, and children, another program offering nutrition assistance for women, for pregnant women often. We have programs offering health care or health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid. Some programs offer just basic social services, vocational rehab, for example. And then we have various tax programs, which I've alluded to before, the EITC, the Child Tax Credit. So we can classify based on the fact that they concern tax benefits, or tax credits for that matter. So why should we care? Why do we care? Why should social workers care about social welfare policy? Well, I think the strongest justification comes from the NASW code. So the National Association of Social Workers drafts a document that governs the conduct of social workers and, to some extent, future social workers. So if you check the Code of Ethics, uh, section 5.02a, I don't think you can get any more specific than this, but it says that social workers should monitor and evaluate policies. So there's a mandate there. There's a clear mandate for social workers, and I extend this to future social workers, for us to keep abreast of the most recent policies and the policy changes and such. So there's a clear mandate there in the code. There's also a section in the preamble to the Code of Ethics that says that social workers promote social justice. So for me, if the mandate is for us to promote social justice, then certainly uh, I think it's quite logical that we have to know something about policies to be able to advocate on behalf of our clients. So a couple of different justifications that I'm offering here in terms of why we study social policy in our curriculum, in our program. So speaking of social justice, this is a much deeper discussion. Social justice, I think, is a concept that we use quite often. And so it begs the question of what that exactly means. Some people define it as quite simply as equality or fairness. We'll get into that discussion in the next part of this lecture.